All eyes are on Dylan Cease at this point. It feels like the Padres are going to deal him. And obviously, we'd love to see Baltimore make a move. But maybe there's another Padres starting pitcher like Michael King that the O's could go after. We'll talk about that and answer your questions on a live mailbag episode of the Locked On Orioles podcast.
You are Locked On Orioles, your daily Baltimore Orioles podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hey there, Orioles fans. Today is Tuesday, February 4th, 2025, and welcome back into the Locked On Orioles podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. As always, I'm your host, Connor Newcomb. And coming up on today's episode, we are opening up the mailbag live here on the Locked On Orioles podcast, answering your Orioles questions. Got a ton of questions that came in via email and YouTube. Going to get to those. But of course, if you're watching live here on the Locked On Orioles YouTube channel, please like, comment, and subscribe to the podcast, but also leave your Orioles questions in the comment section. Going to try to get to every single question in the comments on tonight's live episode. And it's an episode that is brought to you by FanDuel. Super Bowl 59 is here, and there's no better way to make every play more exciting than with FanDuel Sportsbook. New customers can bet just $5, and if you win, you'll score $200 in bonus bets. Just download the app or head to FanDuel.com to get started today. So thank you to everyone who is tuning in here for this live mailbag episode of the Locked On Orioles podcast. We're going to get to a few questions that I've gotten via email and previously, and then we will jump into all of those questions in the chat. So continue to throw your questions in the chat here if you are watching live on the Locked On Orioles YouTube channel. First question was the one that kind of leads this episode. I've gotten it a couple of times over the past couple of weeks, and that is about Michael King, the 29-year-old right-handed starter who was traded in the deal from the Yankees to the Padres in the Juan Soto trade last offseason, and King, who is now heading into his final year, 2025, before free agency. He came up initially as a really good reliever with the New York Yankees. They turned him into a starter, and he looked pretty good. He went to San Diego, and he just absolutely burst onto the scene with the Padres as a starting pitcher this year. Now, don't get me wrong. He was great as a reliever in New York, but he threw 173 and 2/3 innings with a 2.95 ERA in 30 starts for the Padres this year. He took it to a whole nother level in 2025. It's a devastating sinker, really, really good changeup, and then it's kind of four-seam sweeper slider that he goes at you to get the righties out with. And the combination has worked super well in terms of avoiding hard contact, a 30% hard hit rate, 86 mile per hour average exit velocity. Those are both like top 5, top 10 among all qualified pitchers in Major League Baseball last year. Really good swing and miss rate. I mean, a 28% strikeout rate to a 9% walk rate is really good. He avoids the barrels. He just had a fantastic year, and he's only going to get paid around $8 million for 2025. The Padres are kind of cash strapped, which unfortunately the death of their owner, Peter Seidler, they have curtailed some spending. They've talked about trading Dylan Cease because he's a free agent. He's going to make, $14+ million this year. They're trying to add to the major league team without spending a lot of money. So one way to do that is trade one of your impending free agents, get younger, big league ready talent that's more cost controlled back in the deal. The Orioles have a lot of that, and the Padres have multiple starters in Cease and King. Now, I still think, and all the reporting has been, it is more likely the Padres trade Dylan Cease than they do Michael King. And trust me, I would love for the Orioles to trade for Dylan Cease, but I think Michael King is flying under the radar here. He had such a good season. He doesn't cost you as much. He probably won't cost you as much just in what you have to give up via trade. And because Dylan Cease is a Boris client and Michael King is not, King is going to be much more open to potentially signing an extension. Say if the Orioles were to trade for Michael King next week, way better chances that by opening day they could get a 4-year extension on Michael King. That's basically out the door if you're trading for Dylan Cease. Doesn't mean you couldn't sign him next offseason, but you're in the same situation with Corbin Burns all over again. Get an ace-type pitcher for a year and then know most likely you're going to lose him in free agency. With Michael King, it's just a much higher chance the O's could bring him back. He's only 29. He's got seemingly his best years ahead of him. Again, that was only 1 year as a starting pitcher. Think about how much more he could potentially grow as he moves on and learns more and more about being a starter at the major league level. I'm just really intrigued by Michael King, and I think if the O's could swing a deal with San Diego, if it's not Cease, I know King didn't have maybe the season Cease had, but he has similar ace upside. And again, if you could get him and extend him, that's probably better than just trading for Dylan Cease and then losing him after 1 year. Going to dive into a few more questions I got via email. If you'd like to email us with mailbag questions for future episodes, lockedonorioles@gmail.com is that email address. Here's a question from Isabel, who asks, if the Orioles decide to go the trade route for an ace or a top-of-the-rotation starter, I'm just curious, what do you think the timeline would be on this one? Do you think they would trade soon or wait a while and trade for someone closer to the trade deadline? I think a lot of it, Isabel, is kind of about who is out there and what the asking prices are, and asking prices will change. They will go down. If you trade for, say, Dylan Cease right now, you're trading for an entire year of him. If you trade him at the deadline, you're trading for less than a half a year of him. That allows the price to go a little bit down on what he should be worth, because you're just getting less starts out of Dylan Cease the longer that you wait. But the Corbin Burnes trade was on February 1st of last year. We're on February 4th right now, and the rumors have heated up over the past week for Cease. I think if the Orioles are going to make that big splash, I don't think it necessarily has to be before you go to spring training. I mean, the Dylan Cease trade last year from the White Sox to the Padres was in early March. Like, everybody was reported to spring. They were playing spring training games when that deal was made. So it's not like, oh, you get to spring training and your roster is done. Moves are still made. Now, if we get to mid-March and a deal hasn't been done, I think you can probably say, all right, it's not going to happen. But even if the calendar turns to March and it still hasn't happened, if Cease is still out there or King is still out there, there's still certainly a possibility that deal could be made. I just think it's more likely it happens in the next couple of weeks. So keep your eyes open if the Orioles are maybe going to try and swing a move like that. Question from Jim via email, who asks, is it accurate that MLB teams can't trade draft picks except for compensation picks? And if true, do teams ever draft a player, then immediately include that player in a trade? Now, there is a rule in Major League Baseball where you cannot trade draft picks until, I believe, the conclusion of that season. So you can't just draft a guy and immediately trade him to another team. So you can't work around the rule like that. And it is true that you can only trade compensation picks. And that, I believe, does not even include qualifying offer comp picks. So the Orioles received the 30th and 31st picks in the 2025 draft because they offered a qualifying offer to both Corbin Burnes and Anthony Santander. Both guys signed elsewhere, so that was the draft pick compensation that the Orioles got. And neither of those picks are tradable. I believe the only Orioles tradable pick is pick number 71, which is in the competitive balance B round of the draft. Those competitive balance picks are the only ones that you can trade. Of course, they dealt one of them last year in the deal for Corbin Burnes. They've acquired those picks before. They got one back from the Marlins in the Cole Sulser Tanner Scott trade. They turned that pick into Judd Fabian. So those things do change hands. But there was a report this week, I believe in The Athletic, that the owners in Major League Baseball are at least further considering at this point allowing teams to trade more draft picks. Now, it's something that has to be collectively bargained, so it would probably not change until the next CBA is up, which ends in November of 2026. So we're still a couple of years away from that. But I do think in that new CBA, you're going to be able to trade more than just these compensation picks, and it could make for some more interesting trades when these things go through, either during the season or in the offseason as well. Next question comes from Robbie via email, who asks, how confident are you in a Trevor Rogers potential bounce back season? And if he performs to his peak potential, what does that look like for him statistically? And what would the Orioles rotation look like as well? We know the Orioles sent Connor Norby and Kyle Stowers to Miami for Trevor Rogers at the deadline last year. And he had his struggles with the Marlins last season and had his injuries before that. But he was a finalist for Rookie of the Year in 2021 with Miami. Looked like he had a lot of great pitching ahead of him. And he hasn't been awful, but it just hasn't really all come together. Now, there was a good article by Andy Koska in the Baltimore Banner this offseason talking about what was ailing Trevor Rogers, had some back issues that was messing up completely with his delivery. Talked about once he struggled with the O's, was sent down to AAA. He was so much better down the stretch in Norfolk. Talked about the things he worked on in AAA to get himself ready for 2025. I think for Rogers, the potential to have a bounce back season, I'm not going to say it's super high because I don't think it is. But I think there's a good chance Rodgers will have a role in the major leagues for the Orioles at some point this year. If he performs to peak potential is getting back to what he did in 2021 when he made 25 starts and had a 2.64 ERA. I'm not sure he can do that again, but if he does, I mean, he has himself a rotation spot locked down. I know the Orioles don't have the top of the rotation guy, but they do have a lot of rotation depth at the moment. If Rodgers is going to go back out there and look like the sub-3 ERA pitcher he was in his rookie year, the O's are going to find a spot for him in that rotation. I don't think he's going to make that much of a jump, but I do think he could be good enough to at least be a good depth starter that makes 10 or 12 starts for the Orioles this year, posts an ERA in the high 3s and the low 4s, eats some innings. And then I think down the stretch, I think it's still possible the Orioles could move him to the bullpen. And I think he could be more of a weapon. He's got interesting pitches, good changeup, got kind of a funky delivery that especially can keep lefties off balance. I think as a lefty reliever down the stretch this year, that could be where Rodgers helps the O's. And even if he never really helps them for a long stretch as a starter, I think he could become a good reliever. And if the Orioles, I mean, he's a free agent after 2026. If he can even be a good lefty reliever for the entirety of next season, it still makes this deal somewhat worthwhile to go get a pitcher that is going to potentially help you for the next couple of years. Let's go to the next question via email. This is from Andrew, who asked, quick question that came to mind, R.E. Emmanuel Rivera. With his $1 million contract, it seems likely he'll clear waivers and stick with the Orioles. For those of us less well-versed in the system, what would that mean for Rivera's AAA and MLB back-and-forth flexibility? More broadly, if a player is out of option years but clears waivers, what rules govern how often they can bounce between the two leagues? This is a good question. Something I talked about when the Orioles did DFA Emmanuel Rivera a couple of days ago when they made that little trade for the infielder Luis Vasquez from the Chicago Cubs. Talked about it on Monday's episode, so check that one out if you have not already. But I talked about how Rivera is on waivers, and because he's been waived before, he can actually, if he does clear waivers, like if another team doesn't claim him, and that's a little more likely because he's already been guaranteed a $1 million contract by the Orioles for 2025. Not that that's a lot of money, but it'll deter some of the rebuilding teams who might want to see what he's like and get him some plate appearances. If he does clear waivers, he, at this point in his career, has the ability to reject an assignment to AAA. Some players, because of service time, if they clear waivers, they have to go to AAA. They can't become a free agent. But Rivera's at the point where he can say, you know what? No, I want to instead go to free agency. But for Rivera, if he goes to free agency and rejects that assignment to AAA, he loses out on that guaranteed $1 million from the Orioles. If he accepts his assignment and goes to AAA Norfolk, he would continue to basically make $1 million in AAA. Now, if he thinks he can find a job where he's a starting third baseman, he might risk it and opt out. But if he doesn't, and I don't think he will, he might want to hold on to that money and stick with the Orioles. Now, if he does, yes, he's off the 40-man roster. But here's kind of addressing Andrew's question. If Rivera at some point this season, like he clears waivers, stays in AAA, and then the O's have a couple of injuries in June, and they call Rivera back up to be a bench player to help out with depth on the roster, similar to what his role was down the stretch with the Orioles last year. Even though he has cleared waivers and kind of reset his 40-man status, he is still out of options. Once you run out of options like Rivera is, you're out of options for the rest of your career. So even if they called him up for 5 days in June because they needed a healthy infielder, if they wanted to get rid of him off the roster, they would have to DFA him again and expose him to waivers. It's actually very similar to what happened to Cole Irvin last year. Last year was Cole Irvin's first year where he was out of options. He was pretty good early in the year in the Orioles rotation. Then he really started to struggle. They moved him to a long relief role. He still struggled. And the Orioles got to the point where they had to cut him loose and they DFA'd Cole Irvin. Now, he ended up clearing waivers and he went to AAA Norfolk, came off the 40-man roster. And then the O's needed some pitching depth. And so later in the season, they called Irvin back up to rejoin the team. But at that point, he was once again out of options. So later in the year, when they didn't have space for him again, they DFA'd him again. And at that point, he was claimed on waivers by the Twins and went over to Minnesota. So a good question there. No, if you're out of options, you remain out of options after that as well. Let's see. Question from Mark here coming via email. This is a good one. With the signing of Dylan Carlson and Ramon Laureano, are the Orioles going to trade Heston Kjerstad or Cedric Mullins? Mark, I will say Mullins not as much because he only has a year left and his value is kind of low right now. I do think the signing of Ramon Laureano, which, if you're wondering, hey, why isn't Connor talking about Ramon Laureano? The Orioles signed him to a 1-year, $4 million deal today. I've got an episode coming out tomorrow focusing specifically on the Laureano signing. Wanted to stick to the live mailbag here on Tuesday night. But I will say, and I'll save a lot of this, if you have Laureano questions, most of them I'll get to on tomorrow's episode. But I will say, makes it a little easier to potentially include a guy like Heston Kjerstad in a deal for a starting pitcher. Mark had another question asking, even though the Orioles got 2 back-end pitchers signed in Tomoyuki Sugano and Charlie Morton, would the Orioles be more competitive and have a better World Series shot if they had instead signed Jack Flaherty for the 2 years, $35 million he just got with the Tigers? In other words, if the Orioles could undo the Morton and Sugano signings and take 2 years for Flaherty instead, would that have been a better move? I would say on paper, yes. I think Flaherty certainly has more upside than either Sugano or Morton do at this point in their career. You kind of know, well, you maybe don't know what Sugano is in the majors. You know what Charlie Morton is at this point, and you know what the ceiling is that Sugano has. He could still be a good major league pitcher, but you know he doesn't have ace ceiling at this point at age 35. Flaherty, I think, still has that ceiling in there. And here's how I answer this question, Mark. If it were any of the other 29 major league teams who had a chance to sign Flaherty and instead went with Morton and Sugano, I would say the signing Flaherty probably would have been the better move. But here's where the personal part of this comes in. It wasn't the greatest time in Baltimore for Jack Flaherty in 2023. Wasn't the greatest relationships he built. From what I've heard about the Flaherty camp, about the Orioles' thoughts on this, they were both potentially open to a reunion this offseason, but neither side necessarily wanted to do it. And I think there's just sometimes, outside of a baseball player, as a human being in a work environment, where it's just better if you go your separate ways. And I know there was some sort of mutual interest at some point this offseason between the two sides, but I just think with how it went in 2023, it just would not have been the best environment for him to come to Baltimore. And again, I think he's a better pitcher than both Morton and Sugano with much higher upside. So yes, on paper, that move would have made a team better than the Morton and Sugano, but because it's specifically the Orioles, that is where I think it becomes a little bit more even about which one you wanted to do. Good question there from Mark. So that'll do it for all the questions I have via email. Now, let's get into these questions in the live chat. We'll get to them. Continue to put your questions in the chat. I'll start answering those coming up after the break. But first, this episode of the Locked On Orioles podcast is brought to you by FanDuel. Super Bowl 59 is here. One game, two teams, endless possibilities. And there's no better way to make every play more exciting than with FanDuel Sportsbook. Whether it's predicting the first touchdown, calling the MVP, or even betting on the coin toss, FanDuel makes it easy to get in on the action. With live betting all game long, you can adjust your bets as the game unfolds and feel the thrill from kickoff to the final whistle. And the live betting feature, it lets you stay involved no matter what happens on the field. Even if the Chiefs go up by 3 touchdowns and everyone hates it, there's still a lot to do at FanDuel. And plus, knowing you can place a $5 bet and potentially win $200 in bonus bets for the Super Bowl, that's icing on the cake. So download the app or head to FanDuel.com to get started. Bet just $5, and if you win, you'll score $200 in bonus bets. That's at FanDuel.com. Bet with FanDuel, official partner of Super Bowl 59. All right, so thanks to everyone who is joining us here live on the Locked On Orioles YouTube channel. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe, and throw your questions in the chat. Now we're going to turn it over to these questions in the live chat. Let's start with a question from Ali Khan. Hey, Connor, with the price of premium starting pitching increasing, does Mike Elias need to recalculate the value of selecting pitching higher in the draft? This is a really interesting question because obviously every single year, the price of pitching goes up. And the Orioles know that this offseason. They made some competitive offers to pitchers like Blake Snell and Corbin Burns and Clay Holmes and others, and they have just not been competitive enough with the soaring pricing of free agent pitching. So you might think, okay, should the Orioles draft more pitchers higher in the draft? And it's an interesting question because the Orioles overall have been drafting more pitchers. Now, a lot of them have come in the later rounds, but just in general, they're drafting way more pitchers overall in the 20 rounds of the draft. And to me, I am okay with the approach Elias and the Orioles are taking with Matt Blood in the draft, in that pitchers are so futile. They break all the time. you can't really trust them as prospects. You might as well just get as many flyers as you can on pitchers later in the draft, and some of them will pop. And so far, it's starting to work out. Kylie McDaniel put out on ESPN on Tuesday, pretty good prospect writer who's worked for many teams before he got into the media space. He put out his top 10 rankings for every single system in Major League Baseball. And in the Orioles system, top 3 was what we expected. You know, the Samuel Basallo, Kobe Mayo, Enrique Bradfield Jr. It's most people's top 3. But his number 4 was Michael Ferret, who was a 14th round pick, I believe, in the draft a couple of years ago. And already he's the 4th ranked Orioles prospects. Like, people love this guy, Michael Ferret, that the Orioles found out of nowhere. Trey Gibson, he was an undrafted free agent signing. He was in that top 10 list for the Orioles. I think because of the difficulty of developing pitching, how much pitchers get injured, the Orioles are still going to draft some higher picks. I mean, Jackson Baumeister a couple of years ago, they took before the 3rd round. What did they do with him? They used him to trade for Zach Eflin, and Zach Eflin did a lot to help the Orioles at the major league level last year, and hopefully will do so this year and maybe even beyond with an extension as well. So they went and got Jackson Baumeister and turned him into something, but they still haven't done it with a higher drafted pitcher. Like, you've had the guys like Chase Alsop and Trace Bright, who have been drafted in the 4th and 5th rounds the past couple of years, that they are moving up through the system at this point. It is just such more of a crapshoot to develop pitchers, and the Orioles have been so good at developing bats that they've drafted and pushed through the minor leagues that I kind of like their current approach. What we've seen in the last 2 drafts, it's, hey, our highest picks are going to go to hitters, and then on days 2 and 3, we're going to load up on interesting pitchers with interesting traits, and at some point, some of them are going to break out, and that has started to happen. I think I am fine with what the Orioles are doing in the draft at this point. Chase with a question here. I mentioned a little bit already, but with all these outfield major league deals, of course, you have Dylan Carlson, you brought in Daz Cameron, obviously the Orioles signing Ramon Laureano today. Do you feel Heston Kjerstad is on his way out in a trade? Now, I don't think it's an immediate thing because, again, Ramon Laureano is not Heston Kjerstad. They're different players. Kjerstad at this point has a higher upside. He fills a different role on the team than Laureano would. But what these moves do is it gives the Orioles even more outfield depth. And while I just don't think they believe that any of Dylan Beavers, Judd Fabian, or even guys like Enrique Bradfield will be truly ready to rock and roll in 2025, so they maybe don't have the prospects coming up in the outfield anymore, at least for this year, this gives them that outfield depth that they covet. Not that it means they will trade Kjerstad, but it gives them a better landing spot if they do trade Kjerstad, most likely in a deal for a starting pitcher. They can backfill it nicely where they would still have an outfield of Kowser, Mullins, and O'Neill, and you can have guys like Dylan Carlson, Ramon Laureano kind of roaming around as those bench outfielders with good major league positioning, good major league experience that can still help this team out. And Doug had a very similar question. This is Doug Dimmadome, owner of the Dimsdale Dimmadome, who said, do you think it is inevitable for the Orioles to trade one of their outfielders at this point? Again, not inevitable, but I think it makes it easier to do so as they build up the depth that they have been doing. Yep, same question here from Donnie. O's got to be loading up on outfielders to craft a deal on an ace, right? It's going to make it easier. In the same way that signing guys like Charlie Morton and Tomoyuki Sugano made it easier to potentially deal a young pitcher like Cade Povich or Dean Kramer, adding these outfielders makes it easier to deal an outfielder like Heston Kjerstad. So again, doesn't mean they absolutely are going to, but all these moves build your depth and they make it easier to swing that deal if it comes up. So it's not like a huge, great sign for trading for an ace, but it is a move in the positive direction. Let's see. We've got a question from We've Got Movie Sign here. Are the Mariners still a good possible trade partner, or is that ship sailed? I think that ship has sailed. Jerry Dipoto talked last week about how the Mariners went into the offseason thinking about everything and just really didn't want to trade any of their starters. And then there was a report out of Seattle last week as well that the Mariners are kind of no longer actively shopping Luis Castillo at this point, who really seemed like the only starting pitcher they were willing to deal at any point this offseason. Seems like Seattle's going to go into the season with this same rotation. Maybe that would change at the deadline. Maybe that would change next offseason. Things could change quickly right now, but I do feel like this ship has kind of sailed. Luke with a question here. Do you think there's a chance they bring James McCann back as a coach or something? For James McCann's sake, I would hope not this season. Now, February 4th is still a free agent. There was at one point some Big interest from the Cincinnati Reds, but they didn't end up bringing him in. McCann is still a free agent. The Orioles have gone out and gotten their new backup catcher when they signed Gary Sanchez to a one-year deal back in December. I do think down the line, James McCann will be a great addition to this clubhouse as a coach. I just hope for his sake, like, he can still get a major league deal to be somebody's backup catcher and continue to play in the big leagues at this point. Question from Chase: why do you think the Orioles are afraid to move Mountcastle and or O'Hearn and give Mayo the keys to first base? I don't think they're afraid to move those guys at all. I think, quite frankly, they're very open to moving those guys. I mean, there were reports that the Orioles were dangling Ryan Mountcastle a bit in trade conversations last year. I don't think the O's will be super aggressive in bringing Ryan O'Hearn back. He is a free agent after 2025. I think they'd be okay if he walked, which means they'd be willing to trade him. I think they're absolutely willing to trade Mountcastle and kind of move Kobe Mayo into that right-handed hitting first baseman role. I just think Mountcastle's got to rebuild some value. He's had the issues with the struggles with pulling the ball, the issues with the vertigo, just hasn't been as productive as a hitter the last couple of years. Maybe the wall coming back in a bit helps him out in that category. But I think the O's, I mean, from all I've heard, they are open to dealing, especially Ryan Mountcastle. They're trying to find the right deal. You're not just going to move Mountcastle for nothing. I think that's where the disconnect is here. I'm very open to moving Mountcastle in a deal that gets the Orioles help on the major league side back. I'm not as open to dealing Mountcastle to get a 21-year-old pitcher in single A just so we can move Kobe Mayo to first base. Does Kobe Mayo have a higher upside than Mountcastle? Absolutely. Is Mayo ready to take over every day in the big leagues? He hasn't shown us yet. He had some struggles when he first got to the bigs last year. Mountcastle still gives you a better floor to help the team right now. Again, Mountcastle not a free agent until after 2026, so still room to move him before he becomes a free agent. I think they're very open to do it. They're just waiting for a deal where they can help the big league team and not just move him just to put Mayo in that spot, so you don't put too much pressure on Kobe Mayo at this point. Seems like a spot where maybe we can take one more break here. So we are going to do that. We come back. We're still talking Orioles. We're still answering questions. Put your mailbag questions in the chat here on this live episode of the Locked On Orioles podcast. And we will continue to get to those questions right after this. So thank you for joining us on this live mailbag edition of the Locked On Orioles podcast here on a Tuesday night. Or, of course, if you are listening after the fact, make sure to subscribe to the show, leave a 5-star rating or review wherever you listen, whether it be Apple Podcasts or Spotify. That really, really helps out the podcast as well. We will continue, again, keep throwing those mailbag questions into the live YouTube chat. We will continue to answer them here as well. Jim with a question: what do you think it would take to get Michael King or Dylan Cease before the start of the season? Kind of talked about this a little bit early in the show, but it's interesting because, again, the Padres are looking to move salary, especially with impending free agents they don't plan on bringing back because of their payroll restrictions, and are looking for big league ready guys who can fill in holes on their roster. They would want a starting pitcher and they would want an outfielder. The Orioles have those. They have Heston Kjerstad. They have guys like Cade Povich, Chase McDermott, Dean Kramer, who could be moved. Somebody from that group is going to be moved if they go get King or Cease. I would almost guarantee it. What you'd have to add beyond that, I'm unsure. AJ Preller over there, kind of a wild card, the San Diego GM, but definitely interesting to think about what it would cost to get one of those guys. Let's see. Question from Matthew here. Heston Kjerstad for a starter with a prospect for Castillo. So Heston Kjerstad with a prospect for Luis Castillo. I think that's a move that maybe could have gotten done if the prospect was a higher level pitcher. Maybe Kjerstad and Brandon Young for Luis Castillo. Maybe that could have got done from Seattle. But again, they seem like they are no longer really likely to trade him at this point. So I think that ship has kind of sailed at this point. Another question from Doug Dimmadome, owner of the Dimsdale Dimmadome. Would you be interested in giving Kyle Hart a minor league deal? I think he would make great depth. Kyle Hart is someone I talked about earlier this offseason when there was some reported Orioles interest in Hart. Hart was a former left-handed pitching prospect for the Boston Red Sox who kind of was a late bloomer, then got to the big leagues, really struggled, then went over to the KBO this year and set the KBO strikeout record. He was the best starting pitcher in Korea this season and is now looking for a major league deal back in the States. getting a little late in the game for him to come back and get a multi-year deal. But if Hart is now, here's the thing. I don't think Hart would be willing to take a minor league deal. I think he'd rather just pitch another season as an ace in Korea, build his value even more, and then come back. But if he is open to a minor league deal, I would absolutely be all over that if I'm the Orioles. Honestly, I think a lot of teams would be all over Kyle Hart on just a minor league deal. I just don't think he's going to take it. I think he'd rather just make more money and be a star in Korea and then try to come over next offseason. Matthew with another question here. When is Samuel Basallo behind the plate more than Adley Rutschman? Late 2026, 2027? I think when Basallo has established himself, I don't think that'll be until 2026. I think there's a chance in September of this year we could absolutely see Basallo in the big leagues, probably mostly as a DH at that point. But in 26, I think that is when he establishes himself. And I do think we'll see a pretty fair split between the two for 2026 and possibly 2027. And then it does get interesting when you throw in 2027. I think that could be the first year where Basallo could take over for Adley. Adley is a free agent after 2027, so it would all depend on if the Orioles extend him between now and then, but that is the year as he's hitting free agency where I think Basallo kind of jumps Adley in that playing time behind the plate, although they'll both still be, I think, huge parts of this team and this offense, especially at this point. How would you rate the Orioles offseason to this point? Well, total, I still think it's incomplete because I still think for it to be complete, a deal for an ace-type starting pitcher. But at this point, they've done a great job securing the bullpen. I think this is the best bullpen on paper they've had in a while. They have more depth than they've had in a long time among guys with big league experience. They have a lot of rotation depth. I think they did a solid job replacing the hitters that left. I would give it like a B- right now. I think they're missing that big move that gets it up higher, but they also have done a really good job of getting some players with some high upside, but also guys that secure the floor of this team and make them, I still think, a playoff roster heading into 2025. So I'd call it a B-. Hunter with a question, orange pants, yes or no? I hope so. I hope so. I would be very in on the orange jerseys, orange pants, and bringing those back if that does happen this season. Bergie with a question, do any of the Orioles depth starters, Kate Povich, Chase McDermott, Trevor Rogers, etc., have the stuff to move to a high leverage reliever role like Zach Britton did back in the day? Bergie, great question. I think among the three names you named, I think Povich is the most likely to be a long-term starter for the Orioles. I think Rogers could move to relief, but maybe not a back-end role, like a solid swingman middle relief type. I think Chase McDermott is the one with his rising fastball, with his devastating breaking balls. I feel that Chase McDermott is the right-handed version of DL Hall. Remember when DL Hall was in Baltimore and the Orioles kept trying as a starter? And at some point, I got to the point on this podcast where I was just like, look, it's not going to work as a starter. He's going to be a dominant reliever. Just put him in the bullpen. And they did that in 2023, and it worked out really well down the stretch. I'm not at that point yet with McDermott. We've seen him make one big league start. I want to see a lot more of him as a starter in the big leagues before I make that full encompassing, like just put him in the bullpen. But what I will say is, if McDermott helps the Orioles in 2025 in a key way, like say McDermott is pitching in the postseason for the Orioles in 2025, it will be as a reliever and not a starter. Because I think with that stuff, you can throw him in the pen and it can play up big time and he could be a dominant back end guy for the Orioles. Let's see. We got some more questions here. Johnny Hewitt with a question. With King signing a mini extension with the Padres, not really, just kind of wasn't really a mini extension. He just agreed to arbitration in 2025. Do you think they will still trade him though? Or is it seeming like just Cease? Johnny, I still think that Dylan Cease is much more likely than King, but I don't think King is off the table. I just think the Padres would rather extend King. He's cheaper. They have a better chance of extending him. I think Cease is much more likely, but I would not bring him off the table. Luke with a question, has Mitch Keller, right-handed pitcher for the Pirates, been brought up as an option to trade for? He has been. Earlier in the offseason, there was a report that the Pirates were at least listening to offers on Mitch Keller. Keller, who signed an extension through 2028, 5 years, $77 million, so only making about $15 a year through 2028. That's a pretty cheap pitcher. He's been durable, but he hasn't been amazing. Like, he had his good year in 2022. He did throw 194 innings in 2023, but to a 4.21 ERA. Last year, 178 innings, a 4.25 ERA. Like, Would Mitch Keller be one of the Orioles' 5 best starters right now? Yes, he would. Does he have the ace upside that we thought he might have a couple of years ago? I don't really think so. He really doesn't at this point. He's more of a mid to the back of the rotation. Now, a good mid to the back of the rotation starter. And if you added him right now, he would be an upgrade. But I think the Orioles just have so many of those type of guys at this point. They need to make that upgrade at the top of the rotation. I'm not really sure that Mitch Keller does that at this point. Let's see. We've got some question here from Thomas. Can the Orioles extend a qualifying offer to a player that declines a player option? I believe they can, Thomas. That is a good question. Now, there's not a lot of guys where that would make sense right now, because when you're giving out the qualifying offer, that means you have to be willing to sign that player to a 1-year, $21 million deal. And the guys who are in that spot, like Tyler O'Neill, for example, I'm not sure on that one. Now, a guy like Jorge Mateo, or, option to decline on a guy like Ramon Laureano, it's probably not going to come up, but I want to check on that for Tyler O'Neill, because I think you can. I think the Orioles could still potentially get a draft pick out of Tyler O'Neill if he opts out after this season and hits free agency. Chase with another good question here. Do you think Jared Jones from Pittsburgh or Sandy Alcantara from Miami would be a good option to go after? Yes, and yes on both of them. Jared Jones in Pittsburgh, I can't see why the Pirates would trade him. He's 23. He just debuted last year. He's not a free agent until after 2029. And he showed this insane stuff in his 22 starts last year. I don't know why they would deal him. Now, Sandy Alcantara, that is interesting. Alcantara is coming off of Tommy John surgery. He is supposed to be fully healthy and ready to go this year. He threw 200 plus innings in 2021 and 2022, only threw 185 innings in 2023 because he missed the very end of the season with Tommy John. But you remember his great Cy Young season in 2022, 228 and 2/3 innings and a 2.28 ERA. He had a 6-WAR season. He was incredible. Now, you don't know what a guy like that's going to be coming off Tommy John. He's 29 years old. He's never been a huge strikeout pitcher, so we'll see if the stuff goes down further coming off the injury. But if he looks healthy this year, he is a free agent technically after 2026, but there's a club option and a pretty cheap one for 2027. So you could have him, say, at the deadline for the next 2.5 years. If he looks healthy, I am all over Sandy Alcantara. I would just like to wait and see him pitch a little bit coming off the Tommy John to make sure he's actually healthy. Another question from Chase. I know the offseason has been a bummer for a lot of folks, but would an extension make people happy? Adley, Westberg, Cowser? Yes to all the above. I've been saying it all offseason. If the Orioles don't get an ace, but they extend one of their young players, I think it's an A of an offseason. Chris with a question here. Do you think Brandon Young breaks camp with a major league club with a good spring? Young, who was the Orioles minor league pitcher of the year last year, was good in AAA, got added to the 40-man roster this offseason. I think if he has a really good spring, there's a chance. I just think there's so much depth at the back end of that rotation and in the bullpen. It's going to be tough for him. Even if he has a great spring, I think he would still start the year as one of the top starters in AAA Norfolk. But then when the Orioles need to go to starting depth, Young is going to be right on that list at some point this season to try and bring him up if he's ready. Jim with a question. Any thoughts about trading for Framber Valdez of the Houston Astros? I am so in on getting Framber. He has been great in his career. He is a free agent after 2025, and there was talk of the Astros trading him. But once the Astros did trade Kyle Tucker and then now Ryan Presley as well to move around some money, there's been less and less talk about Valdez being moved. Now, it's not saying he couldn't be moved, but I mean, this is a guy with a 2.91 ERA and 28 starts last year. I mean, he's been tremendous in his career. He would be an ace atop the Orioles rotation. This is a sneaky potential move for the Orioles. Yes, the Astros have said in the last couple of weeks, hey, we're not really looking to trade Valdez, but the Astros need an outfielder. They traded Kyle Tucker. They have a terrible outfield right now. Heston Kjerstad could be perfect in Houston, and Framber Valdez could be perfect in Baltimore. I think those teams could be great trade partners. I think under the radar, he could still be available for the right price. Ali Khan with another question here. Shane McClanahan and Zach Gallen both have roots in the Mid-Atlantic. Should we target these guys when they are free agents? Another big yes to both of these guys. Zach Gallen, who there was some talk earlier in the offseason he might be traded. He's a free agent with the Diamondbacks after this season, but he's had a great career in Arizona. He's going to be 30 when he hits free agency. He's not going to be like crazy crazy expensive. I think he would be a really good addition. And then Shane McClanahan, the Baltimore native, I would love to see him play for the Orioles. Now, he's not a free agent until after 2027, so it's going to be a while for him. Maybe the Rays would trade him at some point. He's coming off of Tommy John this year, so maybe that's a way Baltimore could go after him. But absolutely two guys that I would love to see the O's get. Question from Chris here. Will the O's infield be the best in MLB in 2025? That's going to be tough. There are some really, really good infields out there in Major League Baseball, but I will say, the Orioles could have an infield with Connor Henderson, with Jackson Holliday, with Jordan Westburg, and with some sort of Ryan Mountcastle, Ryan O'Hearn, Kobe Mayo combination. Like, I don't think it's out of the question that the Orioles could have at least a top 5 infield. And now it's going to probably depend on Westburg repeating what he did last year and Jackson Holliday turning into the player we know he can be as the top prospect in baseball. If he does that, could absolutely happen. Mark with a question here. Which AL East team is most improved with offseason moves? I would say the Red Sox. I think just going to get Crochet just makes them so much better. They were kind of a middling team. They've turned into more of a playoff contender, I think. I still think they have moves to make. I don't know about the Toronto moves. Like, yes, the Yankees made moves, but they lost Juan Soto. So you can't really improve if you lose Juan Soto. The Rays are doing Rays things. The Orioles have not made the big move. So I would give it to the Red Sox at this point for this season. Hunter with a question. Do you think Yennier Cano is still the setup man in 2025? How can he be managed better to keep him pitching at his best ability? Hunter, you know what I'm going to do with that question? I am going to say that Cano will be one of the setup options, but I will also say that he will not be the only setup option. And I do think that guys like Gregory Soto and Andrew Kittredge and Sir Anthony Dominguez can really fit into that setup role for the Orioles at times this year and can really help Cano get a bit of a break. And I had an episode about a month ago where I kind of broke down Cano's usage and his role for this year. Go and check that one out. But I do think he'll be still a setup man, but I think they'll manage him better because they have a lot more options to go to in the 7th to 8th innings. They can give Cano more rest. I think that makes him better down the stretch when the Orioles need him most. Walter with a question. Your thoughts on the Pacoda prediction for the Orioles to get to 89 wins in 2025? I think that's pretty on the nose for what this roster looks like. And I think if they make the deal for the Big A starting pitcher, you jump up to maybe 91-ish wins. 89 wins probably get you in the postseason. They could easily win 90 plus. That's around a playoff team. And Pacoda usually can be a little soft on teams' projections across the board as well. Doesn't usually project a lot of teams to win a whole lot of games. And the Orioles have pretty much outperformed their Pacoda projections every single year for what almost feels like the history of time. David with a question. Any Felix Bautista news or updates? We keep hearing that he's going to be ready for opening day. So we know the Orioles are going to slow play him a bit in April, not give him every single save chance, probably not pitch him on back-to-back days, but seemingly is going to be a full go for opening day, and that is really, really exciting to get Felix back. Luke with another question. What would be your dream trade for a number 1 for an ace pitcher, and who would we give up? I think my dream right now, if you think about contract as well, is Pablo Lopez. Because maybe Pablo Lopez is not quite the pitcher that Framber Valdez or Dylan Cease are. Maybe he's one rung down. But Pablo Lopez is signed through 2027 on a fairly cheap contract for only $18 million per year. So if you can go get the ace, but not have him be the rental like Burns was, and instead be here for a while, that's the dream. I mean, this is a guy who's been great over the past few years. He's stayed healthy. He's made 32 starts each of the last 3 years. I think it would take some prospect capital, but not a whole lot of it. That would kind of be my dream scenario here. All right, let's get to a few more questions before we end this thing. Alan with a question. How will Kobe Mayo get enough at bats? He will probably start the year in AAA. If the Orioles make a move to trade a hitter at some point this offseason, he could be on the opening day roster. But if not, there's going to be an injury. He's going to get his chance. And if he looks better in his chance this time than he did last time, which I think is possible, he will get them. Or if Ryan Mountcastle continues to struggle, like they're going to give his job to Kobe Mayo. That's how he gets those at-bats. Another question from Doug. What's your biggest concern for the Orioles heading into the 2025 season? I think just top of the rotation, like not having that horse, not having that dog at the top of the rotation. And that's something I still think they really could address this offseason. Shane with a question. How much will it hurt when Tony goes yard at the yard in the wrong color? It'll hurt when he's wearing that Blue Jays uniform and hitting home runs. I wish him the best. It will certainly hurt potentially seeing that. We will go with, let's do one more question here. Let's go with Walter's question. Any idea how good the draft class is this year? O's are loaded with top-end picks, 3 in the first 31, 6 in the top 100. Walter, it's seemingly a pretty solid year for the draft, not like this crazy unbeatable year, but not like this is a terrible year for the draft. Seems to be somewhere in the middle at this point. There's some interesting college hitters that fall in that pick 19, pick 30, pick 31. I think this is an exciting year for the Orioles because they have so many picks, because they have 6 picks in like the first 90 something. That is super, super exciting for what Mike Elias could do to replenish a system that is no longer a top 5 system in baseball, because a lot of their prospects have graduated to the big leagues or been traded for big league talent. This is the year where he really can restock. I am really excited about what the Orioles could do in the draft. That'll do it for this live episode. Thank you so much for everyone who has tuned in live. If you have further mailbag questions for a future episode, email me at lockedonorioles@gmail.com. Remember, I'll be back tomorrow talking about that Ramon Laureano signing the Orioles made on Tuesday. But until then, I'm Connor Newcomb, and this has been the Locked On Orioles podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.